Salut and welcome. Bienvenue, everyone, to SPF25 Virtual. Welcome to today's session, Unpacking Scope 1 and 2 Emissions, a session brought to you by our community partner, the Sustainable Entertainment Alliance. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the ancestral territory of the Blackfoot people, comprising the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, as well as Treaty 7 signatories, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Nakoti Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations. This land is also the home of Métis Nation Region 3. If you aren't sure about what land you're on, please visit native-land.ca and let us know where you're tuning in from. We are thrilled to have with us today Sumin Sohn, Director of Sustainable Productions at the Sustainable Entertainment Alliance, and one of the very new white paper's key architects. Sumin will walk us through the insights, tools, and strategies outlined in this new framework. And after the presentation, we'll reserve time for Q&A. Follow us on social media to stay up to date with all things SPF 25, including exclusive content and sessions. And thank you kindly to all of our partners who make this event possible. Now, please join me in welcoming Sumin.
Thanks, Melanie. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining this session. And thank you to the Sustainable Production Forum for putting on this virtual event. I myself am dialing in from Los Angeles, and I'm really excited to participate today and to share an overview of this white paper that was released only a few months ago and it's about Scope 1 and 2 emissions in the film and TV production industry. I would like to start with a quick introduction about on myself and on the Sustainable Entertainment Alliance. As Melanie mentioned, I'm the Director of Sustainable Productions at the Sustainable Entertainment Alliance, also known as SEA for short. SEA is a consortium of the world's leading studios, streamers, industry leaders dedicated to advancing sustainability, both on screen and behind the camera, in order to reduce the entertainment industry's overall environmental impact. And you can see the list of our members on this slide. I also wanted to acknowledge our partner on this white paper, BAFTA Albert. BAFTA Albert is based in the UK. They are a leading screen industry organization for environmental sustainability. Albert provides tools, trainings, events, practical guidance, thought leadership to screen industry professionals to reduce environmental impact of productions and to create content that supports a vision for a sustainable future. Given our common mission and commitment, it was natural for SEA and Albert to join forces on this project to find global alignment on carbon accounting methodology for TV and film production. To give you a little background on how this paper came about, in 2024, SEA released a white paper on Scope 3 carbon emissions generated by TV and film productions. So the white paper cover that you see on the right-hand side is that report that was released in January of 2024. So this new paper on Scope 1 and 2 emissions was intended to continue that work, continue to build on the work of the previous white paper, and provide a more comprehensive framework for determining and quantifying a TV show or film's GHG emissions. We saw this work as being very important because there was no known global industry-wide guidance on carbon accounting. As many of you know, productions are complex activities that often involve many organizations, shared use of assets and commodities, and diverse procurements. So alignment and guidance was vitally needed. On the reporting side, it was important for our member companies to find a common approach for preparing transparent and comparable disclosures, whether it's voluntary or required. And for the industry as a whole, it was important to get accurate and consistent emissions data to help balance their production portfolios, implement emissions reduction activities, and advance sustainability initiatives. And with this framework, we're able to conduct more accurate industry benchmarking, which is something that we started to do a few years ago. Before I dive into the content of the white paper, I wanted to very briefly explain what the concept of the emission scopes for those who might not be familiar or need a quick refresher. So, scope one, two, and three emissions are the greenhouse gases that are released across an organization's entire value chain. And emissions are categorized depending on how much operational control an entity has over that emission producing asset. So scope one is known as direct emissions. These are emissions that come from the resources or the assets that the company owns or operates directly. All other emissions are considered scope two and three, and they're known as indirect emissions. So scope two emissions are emissions that are coming from the energy purchase from utilities. Scope three emissions are the emissions coming from the company's supply chain, and this is also indirect emissions. And these definitions and standards for corporate accounting and reporting are defined by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So we have taken this international GHG protocol that is well recognized and used and applied it to the green industry. So there are three main sections in the white paper. There are actually four, but I've combined sections three and four together. So there are really three big sections that I would like to go over in our time today. First section looks at setting the minimum boundary. This answers the question of which emissions are relevant and material and should be included in a production's GHG inventory, and which ones can be excluded. Once that minimum boundary is established, the entity needs to determine whether the emissions fall under scope one, two, or three emissions. And this is where we spend a bulk of the white paper kind of looking at different scenarios and looking at the common sources of production related emissions. So we look at emissions created by facilities, vehicles, other sources, as well as fugitive emissions, and we provide guidance on how to determine their scope, the emission scope of these assets. And lastly, we provide guidance on data collection and management. We introduce a concept of data hierarchy to get data that's most accurate and auditable. And we also provide guidance on how to, once you have the data, how to collect the emissions using the primary and secondary data. Entity, I might use that term in my slides as well. That in this white paper, we use it to refer to the company creating the production. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different actors involved. So an entity could be the studio, could be the production company, could be the enterprise. So this diagram helps us define the minimum boundary. It illustrates the different phases of a production's development. In this white paper, a production's minimum boundary refers to the GHG emissions generated from the three content creation phases of a TV show or production. So looking at pre-production, principal photography, and post-production. All emissions that occur during these phases must be included in a production's GHG inventory, and that's what we mean by the minimum boundary. This section provides I say that with a bit of a chuckle because it took a long time or a lot of discussion to come up with this flow chart, but we've tried to simplify this process, a six-step framework for making emission scope determinations. And I wanted to quickly walk through this flow chart because this is what this is the guidance that we're providing for productions. First step is setting the minimum boundary. So what I just mentioned about what falls within the scope of the boundary and what falls outside. The next three steps are determining whether an entity owns or controls the emissions. And if the answer is if they do control or own or control the emissions, then it would fall under scope one emissions. So the questions, I don't know if you can see well here, but we ask, does the entity own the emissions generating source? Does the entity hold an operating license? And then does the entity hold a lease, rental agreement, or contract to operate the emissions generating source? So if the answer is yes to any of those questions, then the entity is deemed as having ownership or control over the asset, and all emissions from those assets would fall under scope one. If not, then we go on to steps 5 and 6 and determine whether it falls under scope 2 or 3. And this definition, the boundaries, these operational boundaries are really important and for accurate and effective carbon accounting and management. And I'll walk you through a few examples because I know that was a very conceptual flow chart. So one of the sources, a common production-related emission source that we look at are the vehicles. For those of you who have worked on production, you'll see many vehicles. And so we looked at how to determine the scope of the emissions coming from vehicles. First thing we had to do was understand that there are many types of vehicles that are involved in a production, and there are many different types of ownerships. So, for instance, a production may not own a fleet of vehicles, they might not rent, but they might actually use crew-owned vehicles. So this is when crew bring their own vehicles and use those vehicles to run production-related errands or activities. In this case, the entity, the production, does not have any ownership or control. They don't have any leasing agreement or rental agreement. They don't have any purchase history. So the scope determination for crew-owned vehicles will be scope 3. This is considered indirect emissions for the production. However, in some cases, the production rents the vehicles. They might go to the local herds. They might go to a local rental company and rent a fleet for production-related activities. In this case, there would be a rental agreement signed, and for the period of that rental agreement, that those vehicles are considered to be under the control of the production. And in this case, the fuel used on those vehicles for the production would be considered scope 1, being direct emissions, unless they're electric vehicles and they're being charged on the grid. In that case, the electricity usage would be considered scope 2. We also go into other scenarios where we look at vehicles used to transport goods. We look at helicopters, jets, and boats that are also used in productions. So these are all laid out in our white paper with the scope determination and our kind of guidance for those different scenarios. We also have in our white paper, case studies. I don't expect you to read all this, but these are fictional scenarios, but very common scenarios where we lay out the scene and help explain how the scope determination is made. So in the case of catering, we had a lot of debate with the task force that worked on this white paper on how do we account for the emissions coming from a catering company. Catering company that comes with a propane stove, for instance. Is it scope 1 or is it scope 2? And the way we interpret this using the GHG protocol is that the catering company comes with a stove, and that stove is part of their purchase catering service. So that would be considered scope 3. It's not, the entity does not own the propane stove. The catering is contracted by the entity, the production, so it would be considered scope 3. However, an interesting possibility here is that scope 3, the emissions, the ownership could be transferred to the production. So if a production, for whatever reason, wants to have greater control over the emissions, they want to track it better, they want to be able to control it better, they can have a transfer of ownership so the emissions from the catering company goes from scope 3 to scope 1 of the production. And we've explained this in our white paper on how this transfer of emissions ownership can happen. So once an entity has determined what the minimum scope is, has determined what the scopes of those emissions are, then they would have to collect the data. And here we introduce a data hierarchy. This is where we encourage productions or entities to use the most preferred data and look for those first before going to look for secondary data. Primary data is what we consider to be the highest quality data, which is most granular, accurate, and auditable. This is the accurate consumption data. So if you look at any bills and there's invoice, for instance, for electricity consumption, there's a receipt for purchased fuel, that would be considered primary data, and that is most preferred and the most accurate. Secondary data can be used when the primary data is not available. So if you don't have direct consumption data, then you can use secondary data to estimate what the consumption would be. So in this case, examples of secondary data are financial data that's converted into consumption data, proxy data, externally sourced data. So this is not 100% accurate, but this is kind of estimating what the consumption is. And once you have all the data that we have in our guidance on our white paper guidance on how to do the calculations of the emissions, and the end product is what we call a global greenhouse gas declaration or an inventory. This is a summary or an inventory of all the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions associated with a production. We provide a template in the white paper, so feel free to take a look, use it as a template. A GHG declaration should include the production name, entity name, the reporting period, and types of data and calculation methods used. So this is captured in the top of the template. And in the remaining portion of the declaration, it outlines the emissions, the total emissions, as well as scope 1, 2, 3 emissions by scope and by source. So this is kind of this second page of that template. So as you can see, the first page had emissions, the total emissions and scope 1. Then you can outline all the scope 2 emissions and scope 3 emissions and provide the whole product level inventory for production. I know I went through a lot today. I hope this high-level overview of the scope 1 and 2 emissions white paper was useful. We really wrote this with a GHG practitioner or professional in mind, somebody who has some understanding of GHG accounting principles, who's involved with tracking and reporting of carbon accounting, or tool developers. So feel free to share this report with whoever you think might be useful. But I hope even if you're not directly involved, if your role is not involved with the direct tracking and reporting of emissions, I hope this was still very useful in understanding that the minimum boundary really measures the full impact, the full environmental impact of a production. Also acknowledging that data can really come from the whole supply chain of a production and the importance of getting quality primary data. And in order to do that, all the departments, all the players within a production really have a role to play in providing that accurate data. I put a screenshot of our industry resource section of the website, Sustainable Entertainment Alliance's website. Here you can find this report as well as other reports. We have our benchmarking report available for download here. We also have a green production tool guide where you find infographics, signage, memos that productions can use to implement sustainability actions on their set. So I encourage you to take a look at our website and find all the resources that you need. And that wraps up my presentation. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the benchmarking report or about the Sustainable Entertainment Alliance. Thank you.
Hi, Sumin. Thank you so much for doing that. Thank you. That it brings a lot of light to a very dense and complex report. And I understand, of course, that the white paper is, of course, really geared to folks that are doing the accounting, that are looking at the GHG. But as we know, this is a team sport. And it's deeply collaborative. So I appreciate your sentiments there, that it's very helpful for people to understand where scope 1 and 2 and 3 come into play, and also how primary data can be utilized in a different way, and also that quality data can come from every phase. I see there is a question that's come in here, so I'm going to start with that, and then I have a couple of things that I was going to ask as well. When a service provider includes an emission source in their kit rental, like a propane stove or gas generator, would that be scope 1 or scope 3? Or is this covered in the white paper? Just want to make sure and I understand that. Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, this is a question that actually the white paper task force spent quite a lot of time debating. It is a complex situation, and the ownership is not often clear. The guidance that we provide when applying the GHG protocol is that the catering company if you hire a catering company, their service includes the stove, the propane stove or the gas generator. So the catering company as a contracted service is considered scope 3 for that production. So that is like there is a case study in the white paper that you can take a look at. I did a quick screen share of that case study, but that illustrates the default is that the stove, the propane stove or the other stove used for catering would be considered scope 3. The caveat that I put there is that there is the possibility to transfer that ownership. So if a production wanted to have more control or want to track that emissions more closely, they can have a transfer of ownership of the emissions. So they bring it into their scope 1 emissions. But the default is scope 3 for your question. But there are opportunities, not just for catering, but other scope 3 emissions to be transferred to scope 1. And
Okay,
that is following the guideline of the GHG protocol.
perfect, Suman. Actually, I'm really thank you for that question, Carrie. And also, I want to dig into that a little bit more. So, why does somebody want to transfer those emissions over? Why might that be a choice that somebody is making? And then also, how do they do that? How does that work? If you could just dig into that a little bit more, and then I see we have another question. So, I'll go to that in a moment. So, you take it.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. I think some entities might be used to considering catering as part of their scope 1 emissions. They can kind of consider it as part of their direct emissions. There might be studios who have very ambitious sustainability goals and they want to have more control over all the fuels or all the emissions or as much emissions as they can. In that case, they would want to bring it in as scope 1. So in terms of how to do that, it has to be tracked. So you have to have the invoice, you have to have all the paperwork and explain it in your GHG declaration, what you're doing, that you're transferring from scope 3 to scope 1. So it's not a complicated process, but it does require the paperwork and the justification and the paper trail.
Understood. Understood. Okay, cool. And then I'm gonna go to this question in just 2 seconds, but also just overall, this framework is helpful to get us globally on the same page, to big players that worked on this, obviously Albert and C. Why do we want to try to align ourselves with this understanding around data sets and scope, um, and scope 1, 2, and 3, and our baselines and our minimum principles? Why is that important for us as an industry? Sometimes people say to me, you know what? I just know that I'm going to do at least 3 vegetarian meals a week. I know that I'm going to have 2 EVs instead of no EVs, and so I know I've done a good job. I've started reducing my emissions. So why do we want people to understand this, and why do we want them to start to implement these principles in their work?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think there's a role for both. So one of the tools that the SEA has is a PEACH, is the Production Environmental Action Checklist, and this kind of lists about 200 action items that all departments can be involved in, starting from, reducing single use plastic water bottles, digitizing and minimizing printing paper to all the way to using clean batteries, clean mobile batteries. So I think there is value and importance in actually getting all the departments involved and implementing sustainability actions where possible. For the work on the carbon emissions and scope determination, I think this is where we want to have accurate data. So you have all the players, all the departments taking action. And you can't, the saying that goes, you can't manage what you can't measure. So we want to measure the emissions as accurately as possible. And as an industry, do that in a systematic way so that, everybody's accounting for catering in the same way or similar manner. Everybody's accounting for, scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions with the same framework in mind so that we can track the changes over time, track trends over time within the industry, but also be able to compare apples to apples, and see, see performance changes over time and be able to compare productions over time. So this is giving productions the same language and the same framework to measure their performance.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And definitely over time as well. And that's how this is a tool for your production company or studio, or whatever, and whether small or larger, for you to be able to also go from production to production and be able to understand the measurable impacts and how things might be changing or growing, etc., depending on where you're shooting, what you're shooting, because you're using that same framework every time, so that it doesn't feel like all of the variables are changing, right? There's a great question here. So this is from Elizabeth, and I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about the fuel and whether or not that default for catering was over in scope 3 or 1. And then what about if the catering or craft truck ties into the grid of the location or studio? So how does that then impact?
Oh, that's a good question. I would think that falls under, the challenge as well as the beauty of this framework is that it provides guidance, but people might come up with slightly different answers. And I think this is a great question and a gray area where, you have the catering that is contracted or is providing a service, but they're using the resources on location or studio. So I think this is where it could be scope 2 or scope 3, and it depends on the studio and how they interpret it. I would actually put this under myself. I would put this under, if I were to interpret it, I would put it under scope 3 to begin with, as because it is catering and it is part of the service that they're providing. But I think this is where there is some room for interpretation. There is room for debate. So curious to hear what other productions would handle how they would handle this scenario.
Interesting. I kind of have a bit of a follow-up on that, and then I see there's a question here from Jillian Stein in the Q&A. So my follow-up is, why do I want to, what is the debate? Like if I'm putting it in scope 2, it doesn't change the actual total emissions. So as a producer, say, or a studio owner or a facility owner or a production company or studio, like a content studio, am I looking to have a consistency for myself so that I'm measuring forward? Or is there some sort of benefit? Like I understand the principle of moving something over in a scope 1 so that I can better control it, because maybe then I can start to say to my caterer, actually, I don't want us to use this kind of propane anymore. I'm thinking I want to go with induction or whatever. You know what I mean? You can have a different kind of conversation, I suppose. Um, so there, if you're moving something from 3 to 2, why does somebody want to try to change that for themselves? And how is that something that could be advantageous for producers who are figuring out how to communicate this out to our industry and the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's as you mentioned, Melanie, the total emissions will remain the same no matter how they're categorized, how they're determined, which scope they're categorized as. But especially because the industry is, there are many different players, there are many different departments, there are a lot of collaborations. It's really important to have this framework set in place so that there is no double counting, there is no oversight of emissions, and emissions kind of cracking through the falling through the cracks and nobody being accountable for them. What this methodology does is it provides ownership and accountability to each
Mhm.
emissions. Having it as part of a production scope 1, they're able to track that more closely. They're able to control that more closely, and that is what we're trying to do. And that scope 1 could be somebody else's scope 3. So we want to make sure we're on the same page and somebody is accounting for that emissions
Mhm.
accurately and tracking it and being responsible for it.
Okay, cool, cool, great. I'm just going to go to this because I know we don't have much time left, and we'll have to close up soon. Following up on the rental and scope decision example, if the prop department has a small putt-putt generator as part of their package and they use it on set, what scope is that generator?
Yeah, so I think in this case it'll be very similar to the catering example where
Mm.
they're providing the generator as part of the service. So that would be scope 3 for the production. So it's a very similar kind of interpretation as the catering example.
Great, good. This seems to be where a lot of folks are stuck. And then it would be difficult, Carrie says, it would be very difficult to differentiate one department's grid energy consumption from all the other departments. Well, that's for sure. that would be complicated. So it would be hard to move one department or one catering truck's emissions over unless you were literally tracking them with, you had a meter literally on that particular place, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where we have the hierarchy of data. Sometimes it's impossible to get direct consumption data. Sometimes you have to estimate and get secondary data. The goal is to kind of move closer to primary data as possible, but we understand that that's not feasible in every scenario. There's a lot of data that you have to gather. In some cases, you have to resort to secondary data. You have to use proxy data.
Yeah.
So that is where we really need everybody's help to get the most accurate data as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great takeaway for today because there is, data emissions, it's very complicated, but it does touch a lot of different people's hands in terms of who is tracking and what they need to give to production to help support with that reporting. I think a great takeaway is for us to try to get to that primary data as our number one as much as possible. But then number two, and I really like what you said there before, Suman, about just ensuring that everybody that there are no emissions that are falling through the cracks, but that also we're not doubling emissions. We don't want to do that either because it does all of us a disservice. And I think that when things are murkier, it's easier for us to not know and go, well, what if we are doubling? And that actually becomes something that stops us from moving forward because it's a fear that, oh, maybe it's already being counted, it's over here. And this kind of clarity really helps us go, no, actually, it's in our it's over in scope 3. So that's fine. Let's count this. And it helps all of us kind of move forward in that way. So I really appreciate that. I know that we're at time. Did you have any final thoughts?
No, and I'm so happy I got to talk about the white paper. It's not always the most exciting topic, but thank you for the great questions. I think this provides a framework and the first guidance, but there's a lot of discussion to be had. As you can see, there are a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different gray areas. So the more discussion we have, the more alignment we can find. I think the industry will find more standardization and more rigorous carbon accounting. So thank you for your questions and the discussion.